This is my FJ Cruiser, and if we go down here on the wheel well in the passenger side, we have a boot that's leaking grease. So if we take a look at our boot, it's covered in grease here on one side, which tells us we have a grease leak here. And if we look around over here, we have grease flung everywhere. So this boot needs to be changed, or the entire axle. So what we've done is gone to the Toyota dealership and bought a replacement boot kit. The kit comes with everything we need to rebuild the axle, including the grease, clamps, and clips. However, if you want to change the axle, the process is the same. So this video will work as well. We're doing it on our FJ Cruiser, but I'm going to show you a lot of details on how it looks in other vehicles, and you'll be able to use this video to change your axle in pretty much any vehicle. Most of the tools we'll be using are pretty standard tools. Some of the more uncommon ones are a snap ring remover tool. This tool is used to open up snap rings and remove them. Another uncommon tool is an axle nut socket. Pretty self-explanatory, it's a large socket for your axle nut. And the final uncommon tool is going to be a clamp press. Now, depending on the type of clamp you have, you're going to either need an ear clamp or a roll-up clamp. Finally, this is a very messy job, so having some carburetor cleaner, some gloves, and some paper towels is going to make this job a lot easier. I have a car lift, but I'm only going to be using one of the arms to show you that you could do this with a standard jack at home. In addition, there's a benefit of leaving your truck tilted, which I'm going to show you in a little while. Now, before we lift the truck, let's release our lug nuts, or else the wheel will just turn. And with the lugs loose, we could lift the truck. With the truck lifted and the lugs loose, we can use a smaller ratchet to take it out the rest of the way. Very simple. Just lift from the top, and it's out. It's always a good idea to put your wheel under your truck for added safety. Now in my case, I have a spacer, just need to take off the spacer. This spins. An easy way to solve this is to put a screwdriver in the fins of your brake rotor. If you have a cover like this, it's pretty easy to take it off. In order to remove this cap, what you'll need is a screwdriver and a hammer. A regular hammer will do, but it's all I have laying around, so this is what I'm going to use. Getting this out is just a matter of popping it out, but it's pretty tight in there and against all the edges. So what we're going to have to do is bend one of these edges in, and then we'll be able to pop it out. Once it's in there, just pry back and it'll start opening up all the way around. Then it's just a matter of going all the way around and prying it open. Just like that. Here is our axle nut. Most vehicles will look like this, although in some cases it's a snap ring that you have to open up and take out, and your axle will be free. But almost all vehicles, especially modern vehicles, use an axle nut just like this. So removing this axle nut is pretty simple. We need to remove this cotter pin, make sure you don't damage it. So with some needle nose pliers, I'm gonna get in here and straighten out this cotter pin. And with that, it should come right out. Then we could remove this cover. And here is where we use our axle nut socket. So let's get our breaker bar. And again, we're gonna need to put our screwdriver in our brake fins to stop it from turning. Typically, this is gonna be pretty tight, so we could use some penetrating fluid. And there we go. If you used penetrating fluid like me, make sure you clean off your rotors, as that oil will affect the performance of your rotors. The next thing we want to do is get our brake caliper out of the way. Before removing our brake caliper, we need to remove this bolt here, which is holding onto the lines, and that'll give us more room to move. With the 12mm socket, break that bolt loose, and we can take it out the rest of the way by hand. Over here on this other side, we have a wire that's also connected to it, which we need to remove. Removing this clip is pretty simple. We just get a screwdriver, stick this in here, just like that. The clip in the front will release, and we could wiggle this out, just like that. The wire here is connected to another bracket. Get a 10mm socket and take it off. Before you remove your calipers, you're gonna need somewhere to put them. There's a couple of options. You could use a bungee strap or a wire like this to hang it off of somewhere in your engine, off the upper control arm, because you don't want to put pressure on those lines. But what I'm going to do is slide this crate underneath. So when I take this off, I'll be able to place it on this crate and it'll be out of the way without putting pressure on these lines. We're ready to take this off, so we go behind the caliper. Looking back here, you'll almost always have two bolts which hold this in. So we're going to get our 17mm socket and release these bolts. And that's pretty tight. So again, we're gonna use some penetrating fluid. What I'm gonna do here is turn the wheel a little bit to get this breaker bar in here and try to get those bolts loose. And with that, we could get our breaker bar in here and try to break that loose. And there we go. And now the bottom, and two. And now that we've loosened them with the breaker bar, we could come in and loosen them the rest of the way with our ratchet. And that's one, and that's two. Now be careful here because your brake caliper can suddenly fall out now. So when you take these out, make sure you have your wires or bungee cord ready. And most of the time it won't fall out, and this is why. The brakes in here are slightly inside the edge. So what we have here on our brake rotor is a bit of a lip. And that lip doesn't let your rotor fall out because the brake pads are holding onto it. So I'm gonna slide my crate underneath. What you have to do to release this is get a screwdriver in here and push these pistons back just by prying on each side. And that should release the pistons somewhat and give you enough room to pull this out. And with that, we could set our brake here to the side. And perfect, with our brake caliper out of the way, we have a lot more room to work here. Oftentimes your rotor will be stuck onto here with rust and just won't come off, and that's fine, you could leave it on there, but if it comes off, might as well put it to the side. Otherwise, you risk it falling off as you're working on it, hitting the ground, damaging the surface of it, so it's a good idea to take it off and put it to the side. The next step is getting this knuckle out of the way. Most of the time, you're able to do that without removing your ball joints. Ball joints are hard to take off. You need to hammer them out, or you need to have a special press tool. But in most cases, you can manage to pull it out without getting those ball joints removed. So in this FJ Cruiser, what we have to do is remove this sway bar. To remove this sway bar, we get our 17mm and we remove the bolt that's back here. We're gonna put our nut back on here so we don't lose it. Here is where we start working on getting the axle out. And the first step is to check whether your axle is loose. Unfortunately, our axle is stuck in there and doesn't wanna come out. So we're gonna use this old bolt we don't need, place it here and hammer it in. We could add a bit of penetrating fluid to help that get loose. And there we go, our axle is loose. We now go under the knuckle, and down here we have two bolts we need to remove. Removing these two bolts will release the knuckle from the lower control arm and allow us to move it out of the way so we could take out our axle. And that's one and two. And with the ratchet we could take it out the rest of the way. And that's one and two. And with that, our knuckle is loose. With that removed, if we turn our wheel all the way to the right, it'll give us more room to pull out that axle. So with our wheel turned all the way to the right, we could pull this out, push in our axle, and the axle should come right out, and we could just set it down there to the side. And there we go, we have access to our axle with a wire. I simply tied it up to here and pulled it to the side and tied off the wire here, and that way the knuckle is out of our way. I'm gonna place this foam here in case the axle falls out, and it'll help prevent that axle from getting damaged. To remove our axle, we're gonna need something like a bar or a chisel like this will do. It can go underneath the vehicle. Here is our axle. What we're gonna do is take our pry bar or our chisel, and we're gonna set it on these ridges, and we're gonna hammer this out slowly. And you'll start to see your axle slowly come out. So we have a little bit of space here, and that's exactly what we want. And with that, our axle is out. And now we could take our axle to our prepared surface. If you're going to replace your CV axle, this is the point where you just reinstall the new one. However, since we're going to rebuild this one, at this point, we're going to clean it up, take off the old boots, and install the new ones. Now, a quick thing to mention, when you remove your CV axle, that's usually connected to your transmission fluid, and when you remove it, it will leak out, unless it's tilted like this truck is right now. So one of the benefits of having lifted the truck like this with only one arm, having it tilted that way, means that the liquid is not going to leak out. If I had used the entire lift and lifted it from all four arms, that transmission fluid would have leaked out, and I would have had to replace it and refill it. And this is extremely messy, so make sure you have plenty of towels and you have some carburetor cleaner to clean this out as well as you can. When removing your clamps, make sure you keep track of which one was on which side. The clamps have markings on them which will indicate which clamp goes where in your replacement clamps. The first step is to remove your old boots, and doing this can be as simple as getting some dikes and cutting them off. But in my case, these straps are very thick. So what I'm gonna have to do is get a screwdriver and try and release them from their clip. With that, we have one clip removed. Two. So what I'm doing here is getting a screwdriver and hammering on this edge right here. that breaks free this clip that holds this in and allows it to come out. And here we have a different style of clip, which means this has probably been worked on, could have been put together improperly, and that's why it leaks. So in this case, we have a couple of tabs, and it's pretty simple as well. We get our screwdriver, and this will open right up. And with that, all 4 clamps are removed, and we could remove our boots. To do that, I'm just gonna pull back on here and be prepared for quite a bit of mess. Taking a look inside our boot, we don't have a ton of grease. A lot of that grease has been flung out, but the good thing is that we do still have grease, and it doesn't look like anything in here is rusted, which is a good thing. So we're gonna get a blade and cut off this boot. And with the boot completely cut, we're able to take this off and throw this out. And we can clean off as much grease as we can with a paper towel. And that's pretty good. We still have some grease in there, but we're gonna leave that for now. And we're gonna remove the other side. Pretty much the same thing, remove the boot. And look at that. Look at how much grease is in there. So we could take this out. So we're gonna try to collect as much as we can. And I'm gonna place it inside of this bottle right here. And again, I could set up some new towels to work on this. Now we could cut off this boot. And again, we're gonna try to clean off as much as we can without pushing these bearings out too much, because these can pop out. They do have a snap ring, but that snap ring, if you put too much pressure on it, will come out. When rebuilding your axle, if you use OEM grease, the official grease from Toyota or from whatever brand your vehicle is, then there's no need to completely clean this out perfectly. The grease that's in here is still in perfectly good condition, and you could just leave it there and top it off with the grease that's provided in your kit. However, if you're using an aftermarket boot kit, you do have to clean this out as well as you can. The reason for this is because the grease, whatever chemicals were used for the aftermarket, could react with the original, with the OEM, and cause it to sludge up, to harden, to thicken, to thin, whatever it might be. It could interact with the grease that's already in here. But as I mentioned, if you're using OEM grease, there's no need to spend a ton of time cleaning this. With everything cleaned up, we're ready to install our new boots. But as you can tell, there's a small opening here and no way to put it in. So what we have to do is remove one of these parts. And in different vehicles, it's gonna be a different side, which is easier to take off. Let's say your housing here is not removable. The edges of this are bent in and you can't take it out. Then in that case, you're gonna wanna remove this side. To remove this side, you get a sledgehammer or a heavy hammer and hit on the inner part of this bearing. Doing that will allow you to slip in your boot. However, if you are able to remove this housing, the easier way to do it is to remove these bearings here. To remove these bearings, you have a snap ring on this side. So what we're gonna do is get our snap ring remover, find the gaps in here, and pry this open. With our snap ring removed, this should come right out. Before removing this, it's important to mention that this has to go back in the same direction. So when we pull this out, we wanna make sure we keep track of which side is the top. So what we wanna do is install everything in here in the order that it goes. So first, the large boot goes in. And before we install the other boot, we need to get our clamps in here. So we put in this small boot here, clamp for the outer, and both of the small clamps have to go in. So might as well put it in there. Now we can put in the inner boot. Here on this axle, we have some very pronounced ridges here that this boot has to clip into. Push this back, and there we go. It popped in, and it's stuck on there pretty well, so we know it's in the proper position. Here in the front as well, we need to push this forward until it clips into its position. We went a little too far. And so far, everything's looking pretty good, and we could start putting everything back together. So we could get our tripod and put it in the same direction we had taken it out. Now make sure your snap ring is able to get in there, and our kit comes with a new one, so we can install the new one. Once you put it in, just make sure it's in all the way. One way to verify that it's all the way in is if the pin spins, then it's all the way in its position. We put our two smaller rings on here. Next, we need to crimp these down. To do that, you're going to need a special tool like this. This is for crimping this type of clamps. So my tool is a bit too thick and I'm not able to get it onto there. So what I'm gonna do is take my dikes and I'm gonna press it down a little bit, just enough to bend that in, but not to cut it. Since these are really thick, there isn't too much concern with me cutting through it, but I wanna go a little bit, check it out, see if I'm damaging it. I'm not, so I'm gonna press it in a little bit more. And let's see if there I can grab onto it. And there we go. I have a much better grip on there. and I'm able to clamp this. These clamps particularly are very hard. So I'm gonna get some bars to use as cheater bars, and I'm going to crank this down very hard. So what I'm gonna do is place this on here. And there we go. It's not the prettiest, but it's certainly on there tight, and it'll do the job. The proper tool to do this is a tool that Toyota sells that you clamp onto there and bolt down, but that tool costs around $200. So doing this is the inexpensive alternative. After making this video, I realized you could buy this tool aftermarket for around $30. And now we could do it to the other side. So I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna take my dikes and bend this up a little bit to be able to grab onto it with my tool. And with that, I should be able to grab onto it. And yes, I am. I'm gonna crank down on this. And there we go. We're ready to add our grease. Now having a vise makes this a lot easier, but you don't need it, it's not necessary. So it's quite simple, just open up your boot and squirt it into there. When putting in your grease, a lot of the times people like to put it into the bearing itself, which is certainly a good idea, but it's not necessary. Grease has a tendency to get absolutely everywhere, and if you just put it into the boot, it will fling around and get into the bearing regardless. So while it is a good idea to put it into the bearing, it doesn't matter if you just pour it into the boot. And with this boot filled up, we can close this up now, lift this up, and try to get that in there. It should kind of click in place, and there we go. And we're ready to clamp it down. Before putting it on, we're gonna go ahead and clean this area from grease. Make sure you get the right clamp up in here. And just like with the smaller clamps, I'm gonna use the same method. And with that, we're able to get our tool in here. We're gonna crank this down. And good, that feels tight. So perfect, one side is done. Now we can do this other side. And again, pretty simple, just squirt in our grease and put in our housing. And with all the grease poured in here, make sure our clamp is on here and we could put this in. And we could get our boot over this. With the final clamp in place, again, we do the exact same thing. We're gonna press it down with our dikes and we're gonna get our tool and press this down. The final step is to clean up our axle. And with that, we've completely rebuilt our axle. We have brand new boots, brand new clamps, brand new grease, and everything is back together now and ready to go back in the vehicle. But before we do that, now that we have a ton of room here with our axle and knuckle out of the way, it's a perfect opportunity to clean up all the grease that was flung everywhere. And with this cleaned up, we're ready to install our new or restored axle. And the way this goes in is it has this pin here, which is a little bit open on the side, and it goes in tight onto that area and clips in on the inside. So what we're gonna do is put this in there. You might need to turn it and maneuver it to get the splines to go in. And then we just use this kind of like a hammer. We push this to the end, go back and forth, and it'll clip in just like that. And we're in. So perfect, our new axle is installed. So putting everything back together is pretty much the reverse of what we did to take it apart. Get our knuckle and install our axle here and get it in there. Next we can get our sway bar in, just like that, and bolt it on. The ball joint in here could spin in place, so you might have to grab it with some vice grips to prevent it from spinning while you tighten it. Next we can install our lower control arm. So what I'm gonna do is use my breaker bar, place it up here, and crank down on this to line this up down here. Get your bolt and put some thread locker on it. And then you can install your bolt. Place your bolt into position and pull down your arm until it's into position. And with that in, it should be easier to get the other one in as well. And we could thread it in on the other side. So just give these a good tightening. And that should be good. We can then install our brake rotor. It's worth giving it a clean with some brake cleaner. Next, we can install our brake caliper, but we're gonna turn the wheel the other way to make this easier. We can get one of our bolts ready with some thread locker, and we can put our caliper in position. Just like that. Feel around until it falls in, right there, and thread this in by hand. We get our second bolt with some thread locker and put it in the bottom. And with our 17mm, we can tighten this down. So just crank these down. There's one and two. Then we could reinstall our brake bracket, again, using a little bit of thread locker. We can put that in there. And with a 12mm socket, tighten this down. Just make it snug, and that's good. Next, we have our sensor. We line this up here and bolt this in. And this clips in right here, just like that. Here on the other side, we have another bracket, which goes right here. And we can install our bolt, tighten it with a 10mm socket. And finally, we can plug this in down here and hear it click. Next, we can install our axle nut. Finally, we need to torque this down. We can use a screwdriver to prevent the wheel hub from turning, but in this case, from the bottom. And this goes torqued down to 200 pounds-foot. Before putting our cap on, we need to install our cotter pin. We'll put on our cover and install our cotter pin. Once you have your cotter pin in, just bend this up and around. I'm gonna use a hammer to make this a little bit easier. And with that, we can reinstall our cap. We can try to straighten out our bend. Idea to use a rubber mallet so as not to damage this more. So make sure it's seated down all the way, and that's good. In my case, I'm gonna install my spacer. We're gonna torque these down to 85 pounds-foot in a crisscross pattern. Finally, we can install our wheel. And with the truck on the ground, we can finally tighten it down to 85 pounds-foot in a crisscross pattern. And there we go. That's everything you need to know, and that's how you change or restore the axle in your vehicle.